Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's Alaska webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Mapping Environmental Injustice, Disparities in Chemical Exposures and Neurodevelopmental Outcomes. My name is Sarah. I'm the Communications Coordinator with Alaska Community Action on Toxics, or ACAT. And before we get started, I want to note that Alaska is a program of ACAT and Collaborative for Health and Environment, and it's also part of CHE's broader international coalition of over 5,000 individuals across the globe. During today's webinar, we will encourage you to send in your questions in the Q&A box. We'll have a couple of Q&A sessions throughout today's discussion, so please feel free to type in your questions at any point during the presentations. We have 4 speakers joining us today. Dr. Devon Payne-Sturgues is an associate professor in the Department of Global, Environmental, and Occupational Health at the University of Maryland School of Public Health. And we have Dr. Tanya Taiwo, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Midwifery at Bastyr University. And the two of them are lead authors on the Project TENDR literature review, which is the focus of today's webinar. And we have Dr. Christy Ellickson. She's a Kendall Fellow at the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Dr. Ellickson will be demonstrating the searchable database of studies on disparities and exposures and impacts. And we have Waghiyi joining us. She is a Sivakok Yupik mother, grandmother, and native village of Savunga tribal citizen. And she is also ACAT's Environmental Health and Justice Director. And in today's discussion, Vi will be highlighting the neurodevelopmental disparities and health inequities specifically affecting Alaska Native children. We're so happy to have all of you joining us today, and I will hand it over now to Dr. Payne-Sturgues to start us off.
Great, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. I'm going to go to my screen here. All right, can everybody, you guys can see the screen? Awesome, thank you so much. All right, I also would like to thank the Collaborative for Health and Environment and Alaska Community Action on Toxics for this opportunity to share findings from our paper, which was entitled Disparities in Toxic Chemical Exposures and Associated Neurodevelopmental Outcomes, a scoping review and systematic evidence map of the epidemiological literature. And this article was published in Environmental Health Perspectives last fall. And the scoping review was undertaken to inform the work of Project TENDR. And I thought perhaps I should say a few words about what is Project TENDR. So Project TENDR is an alliance of over 50 leading scientists, health professionals, and advocates working to protect children from toxic chemicals and pollutants that harm brain development. And we are especially interested in working towards ending disproportionate exposures experienced by children from families with low incomes and families of color. And to achieve this mission, we do several things. First, we publish peer-reviewed articles on the relationship between neurotoxic chemicals and brain development, with a special eye towards interpreting that evidence for policy change. We conduct communication campaigns to garner media coverage and public attention on these neurotoxic threats. And we work to turn this evidence, the scientific evidence, into action by connecting with and connecting to policy decision makers with our science and advocating for policy changes that prioritizes health equity. Project TENDR was launched really in 2015, and in 2016 published a peer-reviewed consensus statement, also in Environmental Health Perspectives, which articulated a foundation for developing recommendations to monitor, assess, reduce exposures to neurotoxic chemicals, highlighting 7 exemplar pollutants and chemicals, which include combustion-related air pollution, lead, mercury, OP pesticides, phthalates, PBDEs, and PCBs. So the work that we want to share with you all today actually got started as part of a conversation at a Project TENDR planning meeting. And we were having a conversation about, well, what definitive statements can we make about racial disparities in exposures and harms associated with neurotoxic chemicals and pollutants in the environment. We decided to conduct a systematic scoping review to really begin to answer that overarching question. But first, we needed to agree upon definitions and language that we want to use in this activity. So to guide our work, we adapted the Healthy People 2020 definition of health disparity, which states that a health disparity is not just any difference, it's a particular kind of difference that is explicitly linked with social, economic, and environmental disadvantage. So we took that definition and we adapted it and created our own, which is what I'm showing you here. So we define neurodevelopmental health disparities as differences in those outcomes that are avoidable, unnecessary, unfair, and unjust, impacting population groups that have been historically, economically, and socially marginalized or made vulnerable. So for Project TENDR, as I mentioned, we're always thinking about how the best available scientific evidence can spur action to prevent and reduce harms. So it's also important then to understand how social differences are conceptualized and measured in the epidemiological studies, because this will help us in the interpretation of the findings and also help to point to the opportunities to intervene. So for our scoping review on neurodevelopmental outcome disparities related to environmental exposures, we aim to address these 4 questions. First, what proportion of studies provide a conceptualization, in other words, a definition of race and ethnicity and other indicators of socio-demographic and socioeconomic disadvantage? How are race and ethnicity and socio-demographic and socioeconomic disadvantage data actually operationalized in these studies, meaning how were they measured? How were they coded in the studies? Do the studies present data on exposure and outcome disparities by race, ethnicity, and other indicators of disadvantage? And what are the patterns? What are the patterns in these disparities and differences? And then lastly, did the included studies investigate effect modification by and/or interaction with race, ethnicity, and other indicators of socioeconomic disadvantage? Meaning, did the researchers actually present evidence of the combined effects of the chemical or pollutant exposure with indicators of social context, social disadvantage, or social stressors? All right, so we created a population exposure comparator outcome statement, which many systematic reviews do, to guide our literature search of PubMed, Web of Science, SynHall, and other literature databases. Studies were considered eligible if they were published in English, conducted in the United States and its territories, involved children and adolescents 0 to 18 years of age, and or pregnant women exposed to 1 or more of those 7 exemplar neurotoxic chemicals I mentioned earlier. If they included explicit group comparison by indicators of social disadvantage or focused on populations of special interest for health disparities like racial and ethnic minorities, and address neurological outcomes including autism, ADHD, behavior, academic performance, IQ, cognitive functioning, or working memory. No restriction was placed on a publication year. I underlined here chemical mixtures. We added chemical mixtures to our search and our review in response to feedback from environmental justice organizations. We had consulted with several as we began our literature search. And the response that we got was we were asked to not just focus on those 7 exemplar pollutants individually, but to also highlight studies that address concurrent exposures to multiple chemicals or pollutants. And this is really critical, really important, given that the addressing cumulative risk or cumulative impacts is of very high interest to environmental justice advocates and impacted communities. So after screening over 14,000 titles and abstracts and over 1,700 full texts, 212 individual articles met our criteria for inclusion into our review, spanning over 50 years of scientific research. And with that, I'm going to turn it to my colleague, Tanya, to talk a little bit about our collaboration and consultation with environmental justice experts.
Thank you, Devon. Thank you for laying out the development of the paper. And yes, before I begin to dive into the results, I'd like to acknowledge the foundational guidance of this work. And we conducted 2 listening sessions with BIPOC EJ leaders from around the country in late 2019 and early 2020. And those EJ leaders gave us direction, as Devon mentioned earlier, around including cumulative exposures. But we, throughout the 4 years that we worked on this paper, we consulted those notes from those meetings several times. And so the EJ leaders formed a large part of how the paper unfolded, and are thinking about the writing and also the recommendations. But I would like to acknowledge a few EJ leaders who also helped with reading the early version of the paper, preparing the press release, and also be available for interviews with reporters. Of course, we have our beloved Vi, who I'm sure most of you on this call know and love really well, the Environmental Health and Justice Program Director of ACAT, as well as Pam Miller. I don't know if Pam Miller is here today, but she also was a driving force behind also the definition that Devon talked about that we use for neurodevelopmental health disparities, as well as giving us guidance throughout the paper's development. The Alianza Nacional de Campesinas with Millie and Amy were also very instrumental in the work after the paper. And then the Jeannie Economos Farm Worker Association of Florida. So thanks to those people and their guidance and their continued work for EJ communities. And it is our hope that this paper will, and the findings will, that they will be able to use it to move their work forward. So next slide, please, Devon. So what we found was that overall, exposures to children are higher for children of color and low income to all of the neurotoxic chemicals examined in the paper. And Devon mentioned those earlier. And so that's one thing, right? That we're seeing that children, and when we say children, we are actually referring, many of the studies looked at in utero exposures all the way through childhood and into adolescence, as Devon described. So as we say the word children, think about fetuses, babies, toddlers, and all of the stages where the brain is developing. So that's one finding, right? That the exposures are higher. But also, we found that I'm still on that slide, that they experienced greater harm. So in addition to being more highly exposed, the experience of neurodevelopmental harm was also greater. A lot of studies will only look at the exposures not necessarily look at the disparities in outcomes. And so we found both of those disparities. All right, now next slide, Devon. And so we also, many of the papers were documenting higher exposures. Maybe, so we had a lot of papers that looked at farm worker communities or Black and Hispanic urban communities. And so they documented the higher exposures, but rarely did the scientists examine how race and economic factors interact with these exposures to give us these disparities in outcomes that we found, as I described in the second slide. We know that we are a product of our environment, and so are many of the scientists who did these amazing papers. And so with our lack of really understanding or lack of rigor being applied to race and studying race, we found that many of the scientists are failing to understand what is it that we need to do to protect children and communities. And it is not just sufficient to put race in the model as a proxy for adversity, for stress, for discrimination. And so we looked very deeply at, were scientists simply putting race as, as a modifier, as a variable in the model, or were they actually looking at these other aspects of adversity that children experience? There was a glaring lack of studies that included American Indian and Alaska Native populations. As Devon described, we had a very rigorous search strategy that really cast the wide net over the time period that we defined. And it was actually quite disturbing to see how, the American Indian and Alaska Native populations were just left out of the studies. Next slide, please. So we also found, and again, as you'll see, there's a common theme here. And so while a majority of the studies found that children in low-income households were at greater risk of neurodevelopmental problems from exposures, neurotoxic exposures, this finding was not consistent across all studies and comparators. And this is, this is to be expected, and this is why you need a systematic review or a scoping review of this sort to really see what does the body of the science says. Lots of the studies found more effects in boys than girls, which is, a feature of the neurodevelopmental exposures. Approximately 80% of the studies that looked at differences in outcome by socioeconomic strata found the strongest associations between the exposure and the outcome. And so again, that's 80% of this of a subset of the studies that actually did this. And when those studies that looked at outcomes by race and ethnicity found stronger associations by either race or ethnicity, depending on what the study looked at. Next slide, please, Devon.
All right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I can take this one.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So, yeah, we wanted to make a highlight here. So, among all the articles that we reviewed, there were a number of papers that really stood out to me. And these were papers where the authors actually estimated the neurological health benefits for minority children resulting from environmental policies and programs that were aimed at reducing exposures in the case of cleaning up Superfund sites, policies around reducing industrial emissions, or tightening up of standards that are used to determine if a soil contamination level is acceptable or not. In particular, I really want to highlight this study by Persico et al. That was published in 2020. This group focused on the neurodevelopmental benefits of cleaning up Superfund sites. This group looked at all children in Florida who were born between the years of 1994 and 2002. They examined the long-term effects of prenatal exposures to environmental toxicants associated with Superfund sites. So these are mixtures of chemicals. And what they found was that the racial disparities in exposures to these mixtures of environmental toxicants at these Superfund sites alone accounted for about 2% of the racial gap in outcomes in cognitive test scores, standardized test scores in Florida, among Florida children during this time period. The other finding here that is so interesting is that the authors also stated that they found strong, consistent, and statistically significant evidence that Superfund site cleanup improves school outcomes on the order of, in terms of magnitude, on the order of about 1/3 to 1/2 of the estimated effects of having a child in a small class size, in educational settings, and similar in magnitude for lowering the risk of repeating a grade that has been documented among kids who attend Head Start programs. So, these findings have huge implications, given that, according to some statistics from EPA, 1 in 4 Americans live within, 3 miles of a Superfund site. So this is signaling that, investments in hazardous waste cleanup is extremely worthwhile, has incredible societal benefits in terms of improving even educational outcomes for kids. So with that, take a step back and think about, how are these exposures happening anyway? Essentially, it's about the policy decisions that allow these exposures to occur in the first place. And the literature is demonstrating that it is having tremendous impact on kids and, in essence, stealing children's future potentials. So based on our review, we think it is time for comprehensive and coordinated action by policymakers at all levels of government to protect children's brain health and brain development through the prevention of, or preventing the production of or use, application, and emissions of neurotoxic chemicals and pollutants into the environment. I am saying this here despite that Supreme Court decision that was handed down on Friday, that we would like to call attention to our federal government, for example, about the actions they can take today to address the disparities in neurotoxic exposures and cumulative impacts associated with those exposures. For example, FDA could immediately ban phthalates from food packaging and processing. EPA and FDA need to do a better job and coordinate and come together and eliminate all remaining sources of lead in the environment that are impacting children, such as banning leaded aviation gas, reducing to 0 the allowable levels of lead and other metals in children's food. Also, accelerating the replacement of lead service lines for drinking water. EPA can ban all OP pesticides. And just to underscore the example I had just described earlier, taking more action for swift cleaning up of hazardous waste sites and Superfund sites. Now, all of these actions really need to be informed by authentic engagement with community stakeholders, with environmental justice advocates. But I want to underscore that not only should there be this engagement in terms of identifying and implementing policy actions to reduce harm, but also actions by our research community. And so similarly, we also have recommendations for our research scientists. We call on our colleagues in the research community, especially environmental epidemiologists, to become more vocal as advocates for change, especially when the evidence about the harms are just accumulating. Instead of continually documenting the harm, we need to turn our attention to what can we do to reduce those harms. In fact, we do need efforts and research around what are the best ways to reduce these harms? What are the best interventions to reduce exposure? What really works to reduce multiple burdens, environmental burdens impacting communities? We also see the need for scientists to improve their studies. Tanya alluded to this just a few minutes ago. I want to point out what I mean by this. In our review of the literature, we observed that detailed conceptualization and justification on the use of race and ethnicity was actually rarely provided by authors. They included these indicators in their models without really fully explaining or justifying why they were doing it or what these variables were really representing. And this was even the case even among more recently published articles. Also, we noted that nearly half of all studies we reviewed did not provide description about how these variables were actually measured. So we would like to encourage, and we like to see the research community, environmental epidemiologists improve upon their studies, improve their methods, demonstrate more rigorous understanding of what you mean by when you're using a race or a variable that indicates race or ethnicity. And preferably, we would like to see more use of indicators that actually are getting at the underlying assumption that race is standing in for racism. And also, Tanya had alluded to this, we would like to see more research looking at the joint effects of social adversity and these exposures to neurotoxic chemicals and how that affects children's brain development. And so Tanya, you want to help emphasize that?
Would love to emphasize the point that you've made so very well, and I think the paper does very well, is, if you were assuming that race is a proxy for discrimination, then measure discrimination. Is it a proxy for stress? Then measure stress. Are you trying to get at socioeconomic status? Measure that. And so you will notice that that we are really stressing that we think more deeply about this social construct of race and apply the same rigor that we apply to any other variable that we use in our model, and really make sure that we are very clear as scientists that we are testing out a social construct, and so treat it as such. Next slide, please. And then and Devon and I seem to be just ribbing off each other like we're jazz musicians or something, but she did allude to this, that the papers did not consistently identify their definitions, and so carefully and consistently do that work of defining those variables and those definitions and assumptions. And also, just like we are calling for decision makers to collaborate with EJ organizations, we also want to see scientists collaborate with American Indian and Alaska Native populations to support existing participatory research and co-create research programs with protocols that are going to fully and in a community and culturally based way provide actionable data for these communities. And so with that, I would like to turn things over to Christy to explain, to describe a tool that comes with the paper.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. So I'm going to share my screen and I'll go through this tool. Let's see. Do you see a Tableau tool in front of you? Great. Terrific. So Tableau is a software that you can use to visualize data. And I'm going to go through this. The whole motivation of building this tool was to provide easier access to the studies that were included in the publication that Devon and Tanya have just described so well. I'm going to go through this tool from left to right and up to down, okay? So the first thing to know is if you go to this tool, hopefully you will, the first thing is if you click on the Project TENDR, it'll take you straight to the Project TENDR website. So you can see what Project TENDR is all about. Then the next, obviously there's a title to the tool itself. If you hover where it says hover here, that brings up a little informational text area that describes the paper and it describes how to use the tool. I have 2 young adult children and they will just click all over the place, and other folks might need to read a little bit and to figure out like what are some basic instructions, to set up. So we've set it up for both of those types of folks. And here we have another description of the various exemplar pollutants that we looked at, and the paper itself and the literature search. Okay, so that is here. And now we're getting to the decent good stuff here. The good stuff, the fun filters and things like that. So these bubbles each have the name of one of the exemplar pollutants. And again, to lift up the mixtures bubble, that came straight out of those 2 EJ leader listening sessions that we held several years ago. And so if you hover over any of these bubbles, which also are filters, it will tell you how many studies looked at that exemplar pollutant. And sometimes it gives you a little description of what that pollutant is. So here it says exposures to chemicals or mixtures, or concurrent exposures to multiple chemicals, little explanation. Also similar for polybrominated diphenyl ethers. People who work a lot on advocacy around metals may not be as versed like me in organic chemicals and may need to know, hey, that's a flame retardant. So we included that. And again, there's the 3 studies when you hover over it. I'm going to pause for a second and talk about the studies versus articles. So within each of the articles, sometimes authors looked at multiple pollutants, multiple outcomes, or multiple comparators. Those are studies. So that like you can think about papers or articles are an envelope that include multiple studies. So we were trying to be clear about when we were talking about studies and when we were talking about papers. And believe me, that tripped me up as we were working through this tool. So like I said, anytime you click on one of these bubbles, it will help you select on the table below. And so the first indicator here is because I selected lead, there are 63 studies that looked at lead. And then we have a little bit of, a descriptor of how many articles does that mean? It means there are 34 articles that are going to then be filtered into this view. Okay. And so here is a little a box with some cells in it. And the way to read this is you can look at the different comparators. So some people compared by language, ethnicity, race. And so if I look at this cell, I can see that there were 31 studies that used race as a comparator and looked at a cognitive outcome, with exposures to lead, because remember, I have lead selected up there, okay? So if I click on even this cell, I can further filter my list of articles. So here are my articles. And if I click on any of these articles, I can go directly to the article, okay? And so that kind of gives you some access to look for some articles to support, you know, statements, press releases, things like that. Okay. Anytime I think, oh, I have overfiltered, I don't really want to be here anymore, I want to see everything all at once again, you can go down here and you can undo your last action. You can reset to the original view, or you can just go back and click. And by re-clicking things, it repopulates everything else. And I could click lead and then end up with all 212 articles again. Okay, so that's a way to find different articles that that you might want to use based on what was the exposure, what was the comparator up here, and what was the outcome. And now we're down here kind of at the bottom, so you see a little bar chart. This little bar chart here tells you the number of studies in your selection that if you compared the exposure to the pollutant and the outcome, there was a more adverse outcome. So things got worse as the cognition got worse as you were exposed to lead, or the study population was exposed to lead. There were mixed results in the article, or there were null and didn't look for it, or was, you know, kind of like not a significant outcome, that type of thing. So that's this bar chart. I'm going to go up to the top here. There's another bar chart. Both Tanya and Devon talked about authors looking at, you know, if there's an exposure to lead and a comparator of race, was that outcome worse? And looking at an outcome. So was there an interaction or an effect modification? So was, you know, exposure to social adversity and pollution, did that make it worse? That type of thing is the question here, the scientific question. And so this is a bar chart that looks at some articles didn't look for it. And that was one of the recommendations that was brought up, look for this. Some, yes, found that interaction or that effect modification. Some found mixed results, like yes, no kind of answer. And some looked and didn't find that kind of interaction. And if you ever wonder what I'm talking about or need to review this, believe me, I sat with those definitions on my desktop during the whole writing of this paper. There's a little primer on what that is, just to remind yourself of that. What is that interaction that we were talking about in that webinar? Okay. So that's something else. There's also some pretty nice tools that Tableau just gives you to use. You can add this Tableau public as your favorite. You can also send some filtered views of this Tableau tool to your friends and to your colleagues. Let me get that back up here. Oh, I have to go down. Okay, so I just select share, but look what you can do. You can do the current view. So if I share this link here, it is going to send my colleague the view of the articles that looked at lead. So that's really useful sometimes. And we use that to write the article so people could go directly to things. You can also do the original view. Okay, so you can share it. You can say you like it. You can also download this. You can download the whole tool. You can download an image of the tool, all the data behind the tool. You can set up the data differently with different rows and columns, save it as a PDF. You can make your own PowerPoint from it. You can download the whole entire workbook and just have it on your own computer. So there's many ways to download, and you're looking for that box with the down arrow for the download, and that type of thing. So one thing I want to show you is there's a lot of Tableau tools that are available to the public, to anyone, and you can search these. I'm going to search 2 of them. So say I want to look for an air pollution Tableau tool, and these are all available publicly. So I can find a whole bunch of different interesting tools about different air pollution topics, some from different areas, and some Tableau tools tell interesting stories. Okay, and Sarah is now sending out the link to the health disparities paper Tableau tool. But if you ever forget where the link is and you don't know where that email is, sometimes what I've done is I type in Project TENDR, health disparities, and I can find our tool, and it's searchable on the public site. It is right here. So that gets us back to the tool itself. And I am happy to go back through that or answer any questions you might have. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you both for those excellent presentations, and thank you, Dr. Ellison, for that live demonstration of the database. In the beginning, I originally said we'd have 2 Q&A sessions, but if it sounds good to you, I think we'll hand it over to Vi now for her presentation. Vi, we're happy to have you.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Bangun Nak. I'm the daughter of the late John and Della Waghiyi. My Appa Waghiyi is from Bunguk Island and Gangerami clan. My Nungyuk grandmother Ayuklek is from the Uwalit clan from Sivokak. I'm a Sivokak Yupik grandmother, Native Villages Sivunga tribal citizen, and an environmental health and justice director with Alaska Community Action on Toxics. And I was also appointed by the Biden-Harris administration for the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And I'm the only Alaskan Arctic voice. And I'd like to thank our creator, our leadership on Sivokak, our partners on a Protecting Future Generations project, Native Village Gamble, Native Village Savunga, our work group members who give us advice and guidance, and Alaska Community Action on Toxics, and Project TENDR. It's an honor to speak along with these co-scientists in this Project TENDR paper. And I've been with Alaska Community Action on Toxics for 21 years. And Sivokak is located in the northern Bering Sea. We started a community-based participatory research project due to concerns from a well-respected former community health aide who started noticing a lot of cancers, low birth weight babies, miscarriages, and stillbirths in our families that had lived, worked, or camped at one of 2 former Air Force bases, which were established on our island during the Cold War. We were an important strategic location for the military. They came and built 2 bases beginning in the late 1940s. So we have had to do our own community-based citizen science because of the 2 Cold War era toxic exposures our people have faced, a burden we didn't create. There was a 1952 agreement which the military signed, basically that we wanted our lands turned back in the same condition as when we turned them over. And at Northeast Cape, they abandoned it. It was a pretty big installation, several hundred personnel. And they built the 2 bases on each end of our island. And at Gamble, they buried everything. And when they came, all they had was their backpack and rifle. And when they came, they brought everything they ever needed for 15 years. So the burden of proof was put on my people. And we have identified PCBs, pesticides, heavy metals, solvents, and massive fuel spills. But also due to where we live in the Arctic, we now know the Arctic is a hemispheric sink for persistent organic pollutants, or POPs. We are some of the most highly contaminated population on the planet due to our reliance on our nakapik, our subsistence foods, especially the marine mammals, which are our main foods during our long winters, including walrus and seals. And then we also now know that the Arctic has the most microplastics of all the oceans. Definitely burdens we didn't create, but we are some of the most disadvantaged, we're facing so many health disparities never seen before in our people. My people lived off the land and ocean, intricately tied with our lands, airs, and waters and wildlife, taking only what we need with the utmost respect. And so I'd like to speak about our current Protecting Future Generations project. When we went home to report the findings from our first Protecting Future Generations project, where we looked at toxic chemicals associated with reproductive health harms. We know that my people have 4 to 10 times higher PCBs than the average American in the lower 48, but we also wanted, at the direction of our leadership, to look at newer classic chemicals. So we heard from our parents and grandparents how the children in my community at the time had the lowest test scores of all the school districts. And so due to these concerns, we sought funding. And it was alarming to learn that myself, since I'm a grandmother and I'm raising my grandson, who's now 4, it was alarming to learn as a grandmother that the grandson I'm raising has a higher body burden of flame retardants than adults. And due to the legacy military toxics, due to POPs that are arriving in our shores and air and lands and water, and now microplastics. There's 16,000 chemicals that are produced in microplastics, but these microplastics also absorb toxic chemicals from the ocean and air as they arrive in our backyard. So the concerns with our children's ability to learn, we sought funding in we have a current Protecting Future Generations project. And we looked at the environmental exposures. I mean, we looked at the environment. We know that these toxic chemicals, as stated before, are multi-generational. I was a child that grew up at Northeast Cape. My father helped build and lived there. So my mother and siblings spent every summer there for 5 years. So my people now, our generation, are facing the most health harms, including a cancer crisis. And it seems like these past year, our cancers have doubled and tripled. And this is environmental violence, where we're being contaminated without our consent. We heard about environmental racism, of how people of color, Black, brown people who live adjacent to development or historic mining, or in our state, we have 700 current and formerly used defense sites, a lot of them, some of them adjacent to our homes, our hunting food gathering locations. And the high levels of PCBs we're finding in our marine mammals at levels we should not be eating them for excess cancer risk. So the environmental sampling we've collected include air, sediment core, newer innovative methods to ensure that we monitor the two formerly used defense sites, and Northeast Cape ranked high enough for the National Priorities List or Superfund. And we heard about how Superfund sites can affect our children's neurodevelopment. So Northeast Cape was never placed, but ranked high enough. So we also look at indoor dust, but also knowing that because of where we live in the Arctic, our homes are closed in more and more insulated due to the elements and weather. But also in our children, we are looking at flame retardants and PCBs, because PCBs, even though they were banned decades ago, do not break down very easily. So I talked about the pesticides and PCBs, PFAS we've found in our people and lands, air, and water. Also flame retardants and some heavy metals, including mercury. These are all health harms never seen before in our people. And we attribute the health disparities, the cancer crisis. PCBs have been linked to cancer, heart disease, thyroid, birth defects. As Andy recognized early on, birth defects, miscarriages, stillbirths. So these are very concerning, because how can we pass on our languages, our creation stories, our songs and dances, our traditions and cultures if our children can't learn? And that we, as in our culture, we honor our elders and our children. And due to this environmental violence, where we're being contaminated without our consent, it is this project has informed our people. We will also produce a toolkit for our parents and teachers to find ways to protect our children, our most vulnerable, to make sure that also measures are in place to protect our children. So this is one of the few in the nation where we're doing our own community-based research. But you heard from my colleagues here on this call that very few Native American, Alaska Native studies are being done. We're a small nonprofit woman-led organization. All of our board are women, majority of them Alaska Native women. We are all passionate to hold polluters accountable and believe everyone has a right to clean air, clean water, and toxic-free food. And it's so important that, you know, as mothers, our womb is our child's first environment. Many of us in our office are women, and that as women we're nurturers and caretakers and of our families, our communities. So I was a stay-at-home mom for 6 years. All my sons are grown. I had no experience in this field, but in the 21 years, I've challenged myself to learn as much as I can, because I myself am a cancer survivor. I've had 3 miscarriages. We were a family of 8, my parents and siblings. Our healthcare system is broken as well. My father had to pay his way from Nome to Anchorage, because we have to come to Anchorage from rural Alaska to be seen in a hospital on the mainland in Nome, and for surgeries and cancer diagnosis and treatment, we have to fly to Anchorage, which is in South Central Alaska. And by the time my father, we found out he had cancer, it was too late. He died of cancer. And my mother had a stillborn child after me. I'm 65. And heart disease. She also had heart disease, diabetes, strokes, cancer. And then we buried my brother. So this is environmental violence. And we heard about environmental racism. And in the 21 years I've been doing this, I am very passionate to make sure that our voices as Arctic Indigenous people are heard. I am very outspoken on the WeJack. I am on the, initially I was on the Climate and Economic Justice Screen Tool to help identify disadvantaged communities, the climate planning, because we're facing a climate crisis up here in the Arctic, but also Indigenous people and tribal nations work group. And I've been pushing for a military toxics work group, because a lot of times when decisions are being made for us, they're usually miles and miles away, and we are never at the table. So I've become a strong advocate for my family, my community, our region, Alaska and the Arctic, knowing how multinational corporations who are driven by greed and profit do not take public health into account. And then the military, US military, it's been very difficult to hold them accountable. However, we are committed as a community in partnership with ACAT and academic partners to find a way to hold them accountable. And there is nobody to hold them accountable. The measures are in place to protect them, including CERCLA. So, you know, these toxic mixtures that cause neurodevelopmental harm, including pesticide, PCBs, PFAS, flame retardants, heavy metals, including mercury, phthalates, all harming the health and well-being of all Americans, but more so Arctic Indigenous people because of where we live due to POPs, but also because of our diet, our traditional foods. And so it's so important that we are proactive to make sure measures are in place to protect our children and future generations. And thank you. I think I had 15 minutes.
Thank you, Vi. Thank you for sharing your personal experiences with these issues of environmental injustice. And I think we have lots of good questions. Can start our Q&A session now. Maybe we can start off with the question of, for any of you, what role do you see for community-based organizations in addressing these issues? And I believe Rosemary asked a similar question about how will states and regions get guidance on community planning decision criteria, and what are some resources for communities with limited resources to attempt to address these impacted further by the mountain of reporting. And
Yeah, Tanya, I was thinking maybe you could mention about Project TENDR's project activity on developing an experts guide and linking communities with folks in Project TENDR. Oh, I think you're muted.
Can I punt that to you, Christy? And because Christy has really been doing the grunt work behind the scenes to get that out. So
Sure. How do I get the link to the audience? I can send the link. We've developed this tool where you can look at where people from Project TENDR are around the country, and that has different definitions. Some people are geographically places or work for studies that are happening in places. So a couple things happen with that, and you can just see where they work, what their names are, and we have a connection to one of the leaders of Project TENDR. You would have to go through her to then find, you know, the Project TENDR experts. So yeah. I guess I'll put the link for that expertise directory, and it's just to be clear, everyone has expertise. These happen to be people who work with Project TENDR experts. So I will send that to Sarah and she can send it out to the audience.
mhm, mhm.
I think there was a question about, was it about states, what states are doing or can do? I can't remember, Sarah.
Feel free to answer any of the questions I saw you typed answers, but feel free to highlight them and
Yeah, I was trying to keep up. It was really awesome questions coming in. Yeah, a question had been raised in light of the Supreme Court decision last Friday that really doesn't bode very well for federal actions. I think, again, it opens the door for states to step in when the federal government isn't doing anything, to be leaders, to be innovators, and to address some of these issues that we've been discussing. And I think it's right. We should be maybe thinking about, you know, how you know, what's coming down the pike and what are states able to do, and maybe having conversations with states who are more progressive in their leanings in terms of environmental protections, and raise their awareness about some of these topics that we've been talking about.
Mhm.
thank you. Yeah.
Can I respond?
Of course.
There were recently several environmental groups filed a legal petition today asking the Department of Interior for a new analysis of the climate damage and other harms related to the Alaska Trans Pipeline system. Also, calls for a plan to phase down the pipeline's operation. So we were one of the groups that called and urged this petition. Some of the other ways that we also were active in include recently Alaska national groups take legal action to defend EPA's prohibition on large-scale mines like the Pebble in Bristol Bay. We helped to advance bill to phase out PFAS chemicals from firefighting foams. And then we also helped to produce and published on human rights, health, and lands of Arctic peoples endangered by plastics, petrochemicals, and climate change. We are very active and work to make sure we work on chemical and environmental laws that are outdated, not protective of communities like mine. We went to the Plastics Treaty in Ottawa, Ontario, end of April. We brought an Arctic Indigenous Peoples delegation, knowing that some of the chemicals that we talked about, like in this webinar, the PAHs, PFAS, chlorinated paraffins, phthalates, PBDEs, bisphenols, and on, including PCBs that are found in microplastics. You know, these are direct pathways into our Arctic indigenous peoples. So it's so important that people may work to strengthen and update chemical environmental laws, whether it's statewide, national, or international. And I've been to Geneva, Switzerland for the Stockholm Convention, the only legally binding treaty ratified by 182 nations. And the US is not even a party. And the state and EPA send career employees to the Stockholm, and they're very active to weaken the language of the convention and work against banning toxic chemicals globally. And we saw the same thing play out at the Plastics Treaty. The State Department and EPA sent 40 staff, and industry also outnumbered delegates and NGOs. So it's so important that we are proactive to make sure that we are at these tables and be a strong voice to protect the most vulnerable, our children and future generations.
Thank you, Vi. Maybe we could spotlight this question from Timothy that you answered about the big picture and advocating for changes in root causes. Do we need policy to lower the production of petrochemical-derived synthetic toxicants, or policy to prevent their use when early life exposure potential is high?
I'll snag that question. Yeah, thank you, Timothy. And Devon's response to that is yes, we really need to do more to address root causes. And I think that is an important part of the role and the driver of Project TENDR, as prevention. And the collaboration emerged from the meeting of an advocate and a scientist who was weary of documenting the impact of exposures, and an advocate who was tired of seeing rates of neurodevelopmental delay continue to rise. And so we actually, and I don't know if Pam Miller is on the webinar, but if she is, I would love her to jump in here. That is work that Project TENDR is now doing. And Vi, you, I'm not sure if you were at the World Plastics Treaty meeting, so feel free to jump in here. But we have written a briefing paper Project TENDR has around petrochemicals and those types of synthetic neurotoxicants. And we have made some policy recommendations, which we hoped to inform the Biden administration's attendance at the World Plastics Treaty Convention. We're going to continue to work on those recommendations, and because it is an absolutely complex and critical topic for us to address. And so just opening it to Vi or Pam, if she's present, to say more.
Yes, we brought this paper. I did go to the Plastics Treaty in Ottawa. We brought an Arctic Indigenous Peoples delegation. The briefing paper was for the delegates, protecting the developing brains of children from the harmful effects of plastics and toxic chemicals in plastics. So we distribute this widely and continue because it is a big concern, because here in Alaska, because we're a heavy fossil fuel industry we depend on a state that depends on fossil fuel industry. So it's a big concern up here, but also I mentioned the Arctic's plastics crisis, toxic threats to health, human rights, and indigenous lands from the petrochemical industry, also which we brought to the plastics treaty. So we are committed to make sure that measures are in place in my community. It's our leadership, our partners are help design the research. This data belongs to our people. And we want to make sure measures are in place, knowing how the toxic exposures from legacy military toxics, the persistent organic pollutants, and now the Arctic Ocean having the most microplastics. Our leadership helped design this research, protecting future generations, and we sought funding after we heard concerns of how they can affect our children's ability to learn. But also we know that the Arctic, Alaska has the most birth defects in the nation, and that our Alaska Native infants have even twice as many birth defects than non-natives in our state. So we're one of the few in the nation doing our own research because of due to the health disparities we are facing. So I don't know if Pam wants to chime in and add.
Unfortunately, I think only the panelists have the abilities to
I hope that
review.
I hope my contribution helped,
Thank you.
Tanya. Mhm.
No, thanks, Vi, for picking up where I left off.
Definitely.
Maybe we can go to the question about the first question from Rosemary. Will preventing exposure by creating guidelines to planning and funding be considered? And if you'd like, Christy, you can also take this to about what states can do. Yeah.
I'm answering the question of what states can do. One of the things that I have been doing and working on with the Union of Concerned Scientists for the last 2 years is educating and studying states that are passing cumulative impacts laws, meaning when there's environmental permitting, that we are not looking in isolation at one source or source category at a time, and not just looking one pollutant at a time, but making permitting more inclusive of reality, And so I had sent Sarah a link of the national, the National Environmental Caucus of Legislators follows states that have proposed cumulative impacts laws. And so you can look at that map, and that's for 2023. So some of those states proposed cumulative impacts laws and they passed. So they're no longer, they've done the work. But some of those states have proposed bills to require cumulative impacts assessments and permitting, and maybe they didn't pass last year and they're going to work on it again this year in legislative session. So that's something to follow. That's a way to, that's one of the solutions for cleaning up or preventing pollution exposures.
I believe states are recognizing that TSCA is outdated. So states need to step up to make sure measures are in place because it's alarming to learn that only a handful of toxic chemicals that are produced, over 130,000, are ever tested for their safety before they're put on the market. You know, that being exposed in our homes, workplaces, and communities like mine because of where we live, and our reliance on our traditional foods, and now to learn about microplastics. You know, it's also these microplastics we attribute to the species die-off we're seeing of fish, birds, seals, and whales, that the warming of the surface of the ocean, plankton and krill have to go deeper into the ocean, and the little fish and fish are mistaking microplastics as their food, and these they bioaccumulate as they go up the food chain. So we're facing so many exposures, whether it's from legacy military toxics, the POPs, the microplastics, and products we bring into our home. We looked at perfluorinated compounds in our people and flame retardants, but along with the legacy military toxics. And we know these toxic exposures are multi-generational, and we were the children that grew up at a contaminated site. We are facing the most health harms, and it's so important that we're proactive.
I would just like to add a couple of points to the really profound thoughts that Vi shared. Vi, I could listen to you all day. I always learn so much, and I'm always so touched by your talks and your linkages, you know, across generation, across species, across polluters. You always seem to do such a good job of describing the totality of the problem. So I would just like to mention two principles that were embedded in what you just said. And the first one is the issue of regrettable substitution. So we and within the plastics paper, we talk about the bisphenols. So many people in the public have been made aware by advocates about BPA. And so very quickly, after a tremendous amount of work that people did to share the health impacts of BPA, even beyond neurodevelopment. And so industry very quickly said, oh, okay, we'll just add a molecule and come up with BPS or BPF, or BPAF, right? And what we're finding is that these substitutes that industry has come up with are actually more dangerous than the original chemical that we spent 10 years studying and then educating the public. And so, so one of the things that we talk about both in the briefing paper and in all of the recommendations that Project TENDR puts out is the danger of regrettable substitutions, and making sure that when we are talking to regulators and decision makers, we are talking about the chemical as a class. Vi talked about the fact that of the hundreds of thousands of chemicals that are produced, they are not tested for their toxicity before they are released on the public. And so we as scientists and advocates and EJ activists and community folks are constantly playing catch up while industry is several steps ahead of us. And so regrettable substitution is a really critical thing that we should all be thinking about in our advocacy efforts, as well as the precautionary principle, which Vi talked about. We shouldn't have these chemicals foisted upon our waters and our air without some testing to ensure that they're not harming us and our future generations.
I just realized there's a way for Pam to speak on the call if she would like to. Let me see if I can do that if you're up for it, Pam.
While you're figuring that out, Pam did share the briefing paper in the Q&A. So if you're interested, please pull that down. It is really a labor of love by many, many people within Project TENDR.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Tanya. I don't have anything to add. I think you and Vi covered the plastics briefing paper really well. I think it factored very significantly in the negotiations at the International Treaty meeting in Ottawa that happened in April. And we're going to carry it forward to the next negotiating session in Korea and just make sure that the delegates are reminded constantly that these are not abstract issues. These are issues affecting our present and future generations, and that, you know, the science is very well established and growing now and growing. So it's just, I think, up to us to make sure that the delegates are held accountable for negotiating a strong treaty that is not influenced by the conflicts of interest of industry and governments that are influenced by industry, because these are factoring very heavily right now in the treaty negotiations. So I'll stop there, but please read the briefing paper. And our plan now is to bring this to an even wider audience by publishing it in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Thanks so much.
Yes, I've shared the briefing paper in the chat on the ACAT website. So it's in there. If there are any other questions any of the panelists would like to highlight that they've answered, please feel free to just pick any of them.
Yeah, I just like to make a comment about cumulative risk and cumulative impacts and multiple chemical exposures. It's really great, obviously, to see states taking the lead in this area, but, you know, very specifically around permitting. But, you know, as we were hearing from Pam and Vi, we're also bombarded with chemicals in our consumer products, you know, that we use in our homes, in our schools, et cetera, et cetera. And what I'm really interested in with regard to the plastics treaty and that briefing paper that Pam and Vi were talking about is, if you think about it, reducing the production of plastics or eliminating the production of plastics actually is addressing a root cause and could address so many problems all at once. I bring this up because environmental health scientists, we like to really focus in on like a particular tiny part of a problem, spend a lot of time and effort on trying to understand like one aspect, wanting to get, say, perhaps like that risk assessment on one particular chemical really well done that also is associated with plastics. Whereas if we could imagine a world where, say, this treaty was actually implemented and put into place, how we could, in one way, completely address so many of these chemical exposures and completely address impacts on the environment. And, you know, instead of like tinkering at one aspect over here, you know, at a time. And so I'm just really happy to see that is happening and that those discussions and negotiations are going on. But this topic of cumulative is huge, and oftentimes people get overwhelmed and thinking like, well, how in the world can we get our arms around the whole issue? How can we really address it? And maybe in some cases, the solution is looking right at us. And here's one example.
Thank you so much for everyone for sending in their questions, and thank you to our panelists for all your insights in this discussion. I think we'll stop there. So thank you all for joining us. And I saw some questions about resources that we talked about throughout this webinar. We'll try to put as many of them on our website, on the ACAT website. And a recording of this webinar will also be up on our website very soon, and it'll also be sent into your emails as well. Thanks again, everyone, for tuning in, and we will see you next month.